We're in Cleveland, Ohio during the summer of 1874. The heat is sweltering inside of the crowded courtroom, Judge Noah Haynes Swain presiding. The judge is a heavy man, but a dignified one, rarely taking the time to wipe his brow, even as the lawyers arguing their case before him make constantly for their handkerchiefs. But Judge Swain is a man who's used to the heat. For most of the year, he's an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Swain had been appointed to that highest court in 1862 by Abraham Lincoln, but during the summers, when the court was out of session, he took his turn on the bench back home in Ohio. On this day, he's about to make a ruling that will echo throughout South Bend for the next half-century. The arguments have finished. The plaintiffs and their defendants and their lawyers lean in to hear the man's words. A riveted gallery holds its breath. For just a moment, everyone forgets how hot it is. The judge is ready to make his ruling. I find as follows that the reissued letters patent number 1299 granted to John C. Birdsell on the 8th of April, 1862, for improvement in machinery for hulling and threshing clover are good and valid in law. Mr. Birdsell is the sole and exclusive owner of all the rights created or conferred by this patent. Furthermore, I find that the defendants have infringed and violated said patent, and this court, by virtue of the authority herein vested, doth order, adjudge, and decree that the defendants account to Mr. Birdsell for damages and profits, as well as the court costs pursuant to this complaint, and order a perpetual injunction ordering the defendants to refrain from making, using, or vending any combined machines for hulling and threshing clover, containing or embodying any of the inventions or improvements described in reissued letters patent number 1299. It may sound like a lot of legal mumbo-jumbo, but the gist is clear. After spending half his lifetime in courtrooms, fighting with lawyers, facing down appeals, and waiting out injunctions, South Bend's John C. Birdsell had finally gotten into the final courtroom to sit before the final judge where he'd won his case once and for all. The clover huller he'd invented 20 years earlier was his and his alone. The people of South Bend celebrated the ruling, waving flags and booming cannons. For a day or two, J.C. Birdsell was on top of the world, shaking hands and entertaining impromptu guests who'd come to congratulate him on his good fortune. But by the 4th of July, Birdsell was back in his factory, facing the sudden realization that his work was only half over. He couldn't spend too much time rejoicing over the end of a long legal drama that finally gave him the sole right to produce his clover huller. Now, he had to figure out how to make some money off of it. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we are going to dive into some of the fun and forgotten businesses of South Bend, running the gamut from toys to bait to underwear to newspapers. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's jump into the Birdsell Manufacturing Company, a story that starts some 20 years before that Ohio courtroom on a farm in upstate New York. A 39-year-old John Comley Birdsell lived in West Henrietta, a sleepy agricultural hamlet outside of Rochester, New York. He was married with 3 sons and made his living as a clover farmer. Now, you probably don't think of clover as a major cash crop, and indeed it's been a while since anyone has. But it was a different world back in the 1850s. Clover was a high-prized feed for horses during a time when horses made the world go round. Besides that, it was known as a replenisher of farmlands, replacing the nitrogen that other crops used up and revitalizing depleted soils. Farmers called it green manure, an early wonder crop that could feed your horses and save your land. But to plant a fresh clover field required a lot of clover seed, and getting to the clover seed was long and painstaking work. A farmer first had to harvest his crop, then separate the hull from the clover, then remove the seed from the hull, then clean the seed of any of the detritus from the first two steps in order to bag pure seed. There was good money to be made in the sale of clover seed if a farmer had the desire and the time to do the work, but there weren't many who did. At least not until 1855 when John Comley Birdsell invented his Birdsell Clover Huller, a machine more accurately described as a contraption that hulled, seeded, and cleaned the product at its master's request. The Birdsell Clover Huller was a revelation, taking first prize at the 1857 New York State Fair, one of hundreds of such awards it would win during the coming years. But as a general rule, it takes more than just a good idea to turn a profit. You need to market your idea, and you need efficient means of production that allow you to make your machine at a reasonable price. You also need a patent, and by 1858, Birdsell would have one of those things, but he'd still be struggling for the other two. The Birdsell Clover Huller looks like a kind of agricultural Rube Goldberg machine, all belts and conveyors, pulleys and levers, arms slicing, fans blowing, but in the end, a producer of pure, unadulterated clover seed. A device like this would prove more than a little difficult to produce at scale. Unlike, say, a wagon, which has at most a dozen identifiable composite parts, the Clover Huller had more than 100, each painstakingly created and assembled in order. In 1858, the same year that he received his patent, Birdsell sold 26 Hullers and lost $72 on each one. Converted to 2024 dollars, that's a loss of more than $70,000, not counting any costs associated with securing his patent. The second problem Birdsell had was a marketing one. To be perfectly frank, when you see the original Birdsell Clover Huller in photographs, it does not look like a device that is going to work. It's got too many moving parts, and the chaos of its assembly does not belie the studied intentionality of the way it was put together. It looks like a game of mousetrap, the kind of thing you'd need to see to believe, and even then, you'd probably need to see it more than once. Birdsell set to tackling this marketing problem first, and during the next 20 years he would travel across the nation with his invention, entering it in state fairs across the United States, and taking home first-place premiums in almost every instance. Birdsell actually made a decent profit at this side gig, often netting a few $1,000s in prizes each year at agricultural expositions and competitions. It was a good thing, too, because he still wasn't making money selling the clover hullers. By 1863, Birdsell had been in business 8 years and was still in $30,000 of debt. He offered to sell the patent to a manufacturing operation in Canton, Ohio, and in a great stroke of luck, the Canton interest declined. It was the last time J.C. Birdsell would ever doubt the quality of his idea. He made up his mind to move west, out toward the places with wide expanses of agricultural land and even better clover country than he'd found in New York. When we come back from the break, J.C. Birdsell and his clover huller are coming to South Bend.
St. Patrick's Select School for Boys and Young Men is located adjacent to St. Patrick's Church on Division between Scott and Chapin Streets. Organized in November 1866 by the Brothers of the Holy Cross, the school holds all the preparatory branches together with bookkeeping, algebra, and geometry. As education is the only object of the school, the terms are very moderate. Contact Reverend P.P. Cooney to enroll. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
Upon making the decision to leave New York, J.C. Birdsell gave serious consideration to a trio of Midwestern cities: Chicago, South Bend, and Kalamazoo. In the end, he chose South Bend for a few reasons. Land was cheaper in South Bend than it was in Chicago. The city had suitable hydropower and available frontage on its west race. But maybe most of all, he was getting ready to file a lawsuit against the St. Joseph Iron Works Company in nearby Mishawaka. It was Birdsell's first lawsuit of many. The man would become famous across the nation for the way he vigorously defended his patent, winning in almost every case. Early on, larger companies knew that Birdsell was deeply indebted, and they dared him to spend his time and money litigating his patent. Whenever he could, he accepted the dare. More often than not, he collected restitution. That was a good thing, too. There were years when Birdsell made more money suing his infringers than he did selling his own products. In South Bend, Birdsell established a factory on the West Race and began printing advertising materials by the pallet load. He sold Hullers on razor-thin margins, increasing year-over-year sales without making significant strides in profit. He started producing his own trade publication, the Clover Leaf, and shipped it into markets across the country. In 1869, the Clover Huller won an award at the Missouri State Fair as the most labor-saving farm implement in the United States. 1869 was also the first year Birdsell turned a profit, netting $50,000, a sum that would be worth a tidy million today. But Birdsell believed that his Huller was worth even more. In 1870, he reinvested his earnings, incorporated his operation as the Birdsell Manufacturing Company, and brought in his three oldest sons as minority partners. The company broke ground on a mammoth manufactory at the corner of what is now Columbia and Western Streets, and printed 50,000 copies of the Clover Leaf. The Birdsell Manufacturing Company also invested in the manufacture of feed and cutting boxes, but that venture was a failure. It invested in the manufacture of Excelsior rotary pumps, but that venture failed too. It was the middle of a long period in which Birdsell tried and failed to sell a long line of ancillary products to accompany its Hullers. But Birdsell still had its Hullers, and at least business was going well. It sold 1,000 machines for the first time in 1872, and Birdsell won $100,000 in patent infringement lawsuits during the year. Birdsell welcomed Vice President Schuyler Colfax as an investor and advisor, and installed a new factory steam whistle that could allegedly be heard at a distance of 20 miles. The Tribune described it this way: "Like Byron's watchdog's early bark, the whistle's sound is bay-mouthed and deep. It is an excellent tonic for early sleepers." It also had occasion to sound that whistle during the year 1872, like when Birdsell won his first patent extension, much to the delight of the family, the company, and all the people of South Bend. When news of the extension reached the city, citizens rushed to fire off their cannons in celebration, a practice that would become a tradition every time the Birdsells won another legal battle. It was a record year in a line of them, and then the Long Depression hit. 1873 did not bring about the booming of cannons at the Birdsell Manufacturing Companies. After selling more than 1,000 Hullers the year before, it barely sold 200 by the time its production season ended in October. The company and its newest shareholder, Schuyler Colfax, were caught up in a baseless but still harmful scandal when the Chicago Times reported that Colfax had used his influence to help Birdsell secure its patent renewal, knowing he was poised to become a shareholder in the company. Besides everything else he had to deal with, J.C. Birdsell would be called upon more than once to give depositions in defense of himself and Colfax. Ultimately, the rumor was debunked, but the real damage had been the cost on Birdsell's time and the stain on his reputation. Birdsell was at this point indebted to the tune of $130,000. and he wasn't in any position to weather an extended slowdown at his factory. There was another way he could make up the shortfall, but it was one that would require him to walk into courthouses with a sparkling reputation. One that would require him to be the one asking the questions instead of answering them. That's how he came to be in that Ohio courtroom before Justice Swain. If Birdsell couldn't sell Hullers, he could claim damages against the Hullers that others had sold illegally. Swain gave him the 1874 victory, and he'd win 14 more cases by the end of 1877, enough to keep his company afloat until the national economy could recover. According to Colfax, Birdsell had been bankrupted 7 times in 20 years and had spent more than $200,000 in attorney's fees defending his patent. J.C. Birdsell would have at least one more patent fight in him, petitioning Congress for another extension in 1878 on the grounds that he'd spent so much time defending the patent during the previous 21 years that he hadn't had a chance to really monetize his invention. It was the only patent battle he'd ever lose. On January 27, 1879, the patent on the Birdsell Clover Huller ran out. Now 64 years old, J.C. Birdsell stepped away from day-to-day management of his company. Running a factory had never been his forte. His expertise had been defending his patent, but now his patent was gone. When we come back from the break, a new generation of Birdsells is ready to take over the family business.
Visit the L Bell Music Store, where you can sample all of the newest records, including an album full of brand new spirituals from Homer Rodeheaver, music leader for the famous evangelist Billy Sunday. We've also got new records from the Burr Quartet and the Peerless Quartet. When you think of music, you think of L Bell Brothers at 106 South Michigan Street, South Bend's music headquarters since 1886. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
J.C. Birdsell's 3 remaining sons were J.B., Byron, and J.C. Jr., and since J.B. was the oldest, that meant he would assume control of the Birdsell Manufacturing Company, an operation facing unprecedented troubles. For the first time in its history, Birdsell would face legal competition. No longer could it compete on the novelty of its idea and the sole right to produce it. From now on, it would compete on quality and price against a dozen other companies, all eager to push the Birdsells from their clover-hulling throne. In short, J.B. Birdsell was going to need to figure out how to compete on efficiency, which was a problem, because the business he took over from his father in 1879 might have been the least efficient factory in South Bend. For starters, the Birdsell Manufacturing Company had, for its entire history, only ever been a seasonal operation. Orders for its products started coming in around April, and that's when it blew that giant whistle and summoned its employees back to work. It produced Hullers as quickly as it could, sometimes working through the day and into the night. The season ended in October, and any orders it hadn't filled by then would be canceled, usually at the behest of the customer. Once the harvest season was over, they didn't need a clover huller anymore. They could try again next year. The problem was that the hullers were so incredibly large. They were difficult to ship in the winter months, and warehousing more than a few dozen at a time was impractical. Working through the winter to build up a stock of a few hundred hullers all ready to go would require more than twice as much space as the factory had. For the Birdsell Manufacturing Company, it was more efficient to employ just-in-time manufacturing processes, 70 years before that term even existed. Of course, running a seasonal factory came with its own inefficiencies. For starters, any employee who had a successful run at Birdsell could almost certainly land a year-long job with any of South Bend's other industrial enterprises. Many of them did. That meant that Birdsell faced high turnover and was left to train and retrain entire cohorts of new employees every spring. These employees tended to be younger, less experienced, and much more likely to get injured on the job. J.B. Birdsell worked quickly to address those inefficiencies. In 1880, the firm introduced a small version of its classic huller, one that would be easier to ship year-round, one that would be easier for farmers to store, and one that would be easier for the company to warehouse. By 1882, he announced that Birdsell would begin manufacturing a line of buggies and wagons in an effort to keep the factory running year-round, allowing them to make at least a little money during the usual downtime, and hopefully to retain some semblance of a steady workforce. After failing for nearly 30 years to develop a viable secondary product, Birdsell's wagons were a hit, outselling its hullers 10-1. Business was booming for the first time in a decade, and the company opened regional sales offices in Peoria, Minneapolis, Kansas City, St. Louis, and Toronto. By 1888, the Birdsells had a street named after them in South Bend, and the company had earned the motto it gave itself in advertising copy: "There is nothing better made." By 1889, 10 years after losing sole right to the invention, Birdsell sold 95% of the clover hullers in the world, a higher percentage than it had when it did hold the patent, thanks to the rampant infringement of the time. In 1890, J.B. Birdsell threw an elegant party to mark the 20th anniversary of the company's incorporation and its grand opening of a signature storefront on Wabash Street in Chicago. The Birdsell family cleared out the factory's largest warehouse space and decorated it with an extravagance previously unknown in South Bend. Japanese shades framed every window, tuxedoed butlers served lemonade, exquisite topiaries were trimmed and cut in the shape of their clover hullers. The party started at 8:30 p.m. and lasted until daylight. Lorenz Elbel led the music and the dancing. The newspapers reported on the celebration as if it were a red carpet premiere, using its precious column inches to note the color and style of every single dress worn by every single woman who attended. They raved a little more than was seemly about the elegant toilets that the Birdsells provided for their guests. But the high point of the evening came with a surprise appearance by the family's patriarch, J.C. Birdsell, believed to be ailing and unable to attend. Shortly after 11 p.m., he stepped into the gala, bringing a hush to the disbelieving crowd before the throngs began to cheer for the man whose ingenuity and tenacity had built all of this in the first place. They remembered that they used to fire off cannons to celebrate his victories, because his victories had been their victories too. The elder Birdsell remained at the party until the clock ticked past midnight, officially marking his 75th birthday. The rest of the revelers still had 7 hours to go. How would the Birdsell Manufacturing Company follow up on a high point like that one? By doing my favorite thing it ever did, hiring a weird marketing guy who composed unhinged poetry that ran in Birdsell advertisements in the newspapers every single week. I would like to read one of those to you now. If you should go to Mexico along the Santa Fe, you'd find the Birdsell wagon there, a-hauling every day. Poetry like this ran in Birdsell ads in the papers every week for 2 years and became the kind of groan-worthy event that the people of South Bend came to look forward to. In more serious business, the same marketing guy reached back to the company's roots, taking its wagons and buggies on the state fair circuit, taking first prize at the 1892 Missouri Fair. It sent one huller to the World's Fair and another to a European exhibition at Antwerp, taking first prize at both. It opened more offices: Bloomington, Illinois, Columbus, Ohio, Indianapolis. The only thing that could bring the Birdsells down from the top of the world happened on July 13, 1894, when J.C. Birdsell died of a stroke, just a few years after turning 79. The family, the company, and the city all mourned. But business kept humming along, and soon enough, the Birdsells were building stately homes throughout the city. J.B. built his at 511 West Colfax in 1896. J.C. Jr. built his at 1249 East Jefferson in 1902. Byron was more reserved, keeping a fine but not extravagant home at 714 West Washington for most of his adult life. By 1905, the company was making 18,000 wagons a year, and in 1906, it doubled its production from the year before. It sent hullers to Russia, Argentina, and Australia. And then, just like had happened once before, the family was visited by tragedy even at the peak of their success. J.B. Birdsell died on September 27, 1906, at the age of 62. His passing delivered the presidency of the company to the next brother, Byron. Byron held the title 9 years before he expired, at last passing the presidency to J.C. Jr. He couldn't have known it, but the youngest Birdsell son would be the last president his company ever had. World War I was not good for Birdsell, and the end of the war didn't bring much relief. The Birdsell factory was barely operating at 50% capacity into the 1920s, a decade that roared for much of America, but left the Birdsell Manufacturing Company at a dull whimper. As late as 1925, the company was still expressing optimism, but after 3 or 4 years of glass-half-full platitudes followed by underwhelming sales numbers, the writing was on the wall. It's not certain when the company's leadership finally realized that they'd been too late to adapt to an already changed world, but by the time they did, it was too late. By the time the war ended, wagons and buggies had been phased out in favor of tractors and cars. By 1930, Birdsell had sold off its entire wagon division to the Kentucky Wagon Company, the same firm that bought out Studebaker's wagon business a year prior. On July 21st of that same year, fires razed some of the buildings on the Birdsell campus, but it was no interruption to business. The newspaper reported that the burned buildings were the abandoned ones. But Birdsell still had its Clover Huller, the invention that had started and sustained the business in the first place. With its wagons and buggies firmly out of the picture, the company's new strategy was obvious. It would construct Clover Hullers with a laser-like focus, and in doing so, it would rescue the fortunes of everyone who worked for them. It didn't work. It was never going to work. Despite the prestige and awards attached to the Birdsell Clover Huller, it was only ever a niche product. Not only had the automotive revolution replaced wagons with tractors and buggies with cars, it had also made horses obsolete. The demand for clover had plummeted along with them. Farmers discovered that soybeans were more effective as farmland replenishers than clover. It didn't mean that the Birdsell Clover Huller wasn't a brilliant machine, just that it solved a problem that had gone away on its own. In 1932, the last parts of the Birdsell Manufacturing Company were sold off to Ollie Chambers, co-headquartered in Milwaukee and LaPorte. The company was officially dissolved on July 23, 1932. J.C. Birdsell Jr. died on April 3, 1937. At the time of his death, his estate was valued at $184, according to probate records listed in the South Bend Tribune. On September 15, 1938, fire leveled the old Birdsell factory. Today, there's nothing left of the manufacturing facilities, but the mansions built by J.B. and J.C. Jr. are still standing. They're worth a look. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. Our next episode in the Forgotten Businesses series will cover the George Cutter Company, and I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.